Just a warning, in this episode of No Filter, we'll be speaking about George Pell. There are no graphic details, but we still wanted to give you a heads up. For 24-hour support, please call 1-800-RESPECT or Lifeline on 13 11 14.
One of the difficult parts that the family, so he as the father, went through was not knowing, because you sort of had a child that was really going off the rails but not knowing why.
From Mamma Mia, I'm Mia Friedman and you're listening to No Filter, candid conversations that count. How do you give people a voice when they're too afraid or too ashamed to tell their own stories? For the past 20 years, my guest today has been that voice for over 1,000 victims and survivors of child sexual abuse. Right now, Lisa Flynn is representing the father of one of the choir boys who was sexually abused by George Pell at the age of just 13. This boy's young life was never the same after it happened, and R, as he's been known throughout the trial, withdrew from his family and began taking really hard drugs very soon after the abuse happened. He died of an overdose at age 31. Now, George Pell is serving a prison term of 3 years and 8 months for the abuse of those two boys, and on the day he was sentenced, Lisa Flynn sat beside R's father in the courtroom. Lisa, who works at Shine Lawyers, has 3 young children of her own, and every day she gets up and goes to work where she fights for the rights of children who didn't have a voice when they were abused by adults. Many of those children are now adults themselves, and they're cautiously, emotionally coming out with their stories. So how does she take all that on? How's R's father doing in the wake of Pell's sentencing? And what happens next? And most importantly, what patterns has Lisa Flynn seen when it comes to identifying abusers? So Lisa, the day that George Pell was sentenced, you were in the court.
Yes.
How did the day play out?
It was a hugely emotional day. So I sat next to our client. It was a tough day for him. On one hand, he was satisfied in some sense that justice has been served, in that the person responsible for committing the crimes against his child has been convicted and has received a jail sentence for that. However, it was really sad for him to listen to the sentencing remarks, to hear again how terrified and scared his 13-year-old son was at the time of the assault, to reflect on the drug abuse that ultimately took his life. And I think that he was, a bit disappointed with the overall sentence, although respectful of the judge's comments and the judge's decision, but it was just sad.
Tell me about your client and his son.
So when he speaks about what his son was like prior to the abuse, which we know now happened when he was 13 years old, his face lights up as he describes watching the football together and his son sitting on the side of the armchair, cheering their favourite football team on, and that he used to love taking him to games, and I guess normal, beautiful father and son relationship things. And then his whole demeanour changes when he talks about his son after he struggled with drugs, and he just reflects on what a waste of a life. And he says that there's nothing else that could have caused the downward spiral that he did, and a lot of sadness in terms of what he saw his son go through, and a feelings of guilt as well, that he didn't know what was happening, that he couldn't help his son, that he didn't reach out, and their common feelings in terms of parents when they do find out that their child was a victim of child sexual abuse.
R was abused when he was 13, like the other victim, Jay.
Yes.
They were abused in that same instance, and then Jay was abused subsequently by Pell, according to the law, I suppose, that has been found now. When did R's parents notice that his behaviour changed, and how did it change? What did he start doing?
It was very soon after. So when he was around 14, he became very withdrawn. So our client describes other family members, so R's grandmother noticing a change where he was withdrawing from the family. And then there was drug abuse, and quite heavy drug abuse from a very young age. So the drug abuse coupled with this withdrawal from not wanting to watch football with his dad, not wanting to talk to his grandma, not wanting to bake, which he enjoyed sort of prior to that. So there was a very big difference in how he was interacting with his family.
What you describe is, I guess, a more extreme version of the way some boys, when they hit puberty, they do sort of pull away. Teenage boys, they sort of pull away and their behaviour can change. When did it occur to them that this was something more than just normal kind of adolescent development?
Yeah, so you are right in terms of at the start, they did think that he's a teenager now, he doesn't want to be around his parents so much, but they did certainly suspect that something wasn't normal sort of teenage behaviour. He would be away from the home for days. The drug abuse really escalated and he was withdrawing from the world.
Did he continue in the choir?
No, he stopped at some time after. I'm not too sure exactly how long after, but he ceased that as well, which was an important part of his life prior to that because it was a scholarship and a lot involved with that and something that he really enjoyed. So that ceased as well.
So the fact that R was on a scholarship, what did that mean to his family?
They were very proud. They attended church. Our client describes that he didn't really know that his son had a beautiful singing voice until sort of one day out of the blue he announced that he was in the choir and sang for him. So it was important to them. It was something that they were proud and very supportive of their son in doing that because it was something that he enjoyed.
So were the stakes pretty high given that he was on a scholarship, and in terms of the judge spoke about the power dynamics and how not only was George Pell a cardinal and they were choir boys, but also the consequences for potentially speaking up or complaining were enormous.
What we do know for any victim of child sexual abuse is that it's incredibly hard for them to speak out, especially at the time that the abuse has occurred. Often they're very young, they can't even comprehend or understand that it is abuse that's happening to them. And often it is a person, as in this case, where they are in a position of incredible power over the victim. And so to speak out against them, there would be thoughts of whether they would be believed. Often there are threats at times that they won't be believed or that they'll be harmed, and even if there's not overt threats, I'm sure that it would be in people's mind in terms of, well, what would happen if I reported this? Who would believe me? Would I be in trouble? Would I be accused of lying? So all of those confusing, conflicting emotions are often really evident there as a child, where it's pretty much impossible for them to come forward and report it.
And even the words they would have to use to describe what had happened, like the shame and the embarrassment and around that.
That's right. For a 13-year-old boy, incredibly, incredibly difficult. Just so many factors at play, and being at an age where you're only just beginning to understand sex and your own sexuality and all of those things, when that is in some cases your first sexual experience, it has such a significant impact on the way that a life can go.
When you ask a 13-year-old boy what's wrong, are you okay, you rarely get a very satisfying answer. I imagine his parents tried to work out what was going on with their son.
They did. They sought assistance from a psychologist to try and work out what was wrong and how they could help. There was evidence at the trial that not our client but his mother asked as to whether he had suffered abuse, as
she asked directly.
And she may have suspected that. But even after the abuse has finished, it's so incredibly difficult to report what has happened. There's a lot of stigma and shame. To be able to articulate that to your mum or your dad is incredibly hard.
Let alone police.
What would be the outcome? And we know from all of the work of the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse that concluded at the end of 2017 that it can take decades for someone to really be able to comprehend what has happened to them and to be able to voice and report what has happened to them. So the fact that our client really never had a chance to do that because he passed away so young, but it's not uncommon even when people are asked directly whether they've been abused or whether something's happened, it's not uncommon for them not to be able to articulate or speak up or say what's happened to them.
You work with victims of child sexual assault often, and in your career that's what you do.
Yes.
For most of us, the first exposure we would have had to that world and that issue is either the Royal Commission or Pell, or for many people the Michael Jackson documentary.
Yes.
And what you say is echoed in that, where Michael Jackson's accusers, Wade Robson and James Safechuck, their mothers asked them directly when other boys came forward and accused Michael Jackson, and they said, did this happen to you? Did he ever try? And they said no. They said no. They said it as children. And then Wade Robson also said it as an adult. They said it to their parents. They testified in court. And some people have said, because they said no then, how can they be believed now? And they perjured themselves, and they are a known, proven liar. What do you say to that? I
think that it doesn't take into account the incredible complexities of someone who has suffered abuse as a child, the trauma that has, and that how it affects your whole life after that. I think that there is that shame and stigma of saying what happened to them and the intimate details of that. Some survivors are in denial that they don't want to think about. They've spent the whole of their life blocking out or trying to block out the memories of the abuse, which has had such an impact. So there's a lot of complexities around childhood trauma and the impact that it's had, and a lot of research in terms of to explain that lack of reporting or the even sort of denial when asked specifically. So I think that to make sort of comments like that, I guess I can understand that if you aren't aware of the research and the complexities and having experienced and spoken to survivors of abuse, because it's probably more common than not to deny it or not be able to speak about it for many, many years.
Your client's son, he got into drugs when he was a teenager. Then how did his life map out?
So despite attempts at rehabilitation and to get off drugs, he was never really able to do that. And it led to a couple of periods of incarceration for drug-related offences.
When he was how old?
So the most recent one was just before he passed away at 31, because he'd only been out of prison for a short time. And his dad has often told me the story that he went to visit him in prison one day, and the prison guard said to him, "What is your son doing in here? You know, he's a really nice kid. He's a beautiful manners. He shouldn't be in here. He doesn't belong here." He was a good kid, but he just used the drugs to escape and to get away from the memories that he had or the reality that he couldn't deal with. And it ultimately led to drug overdose when he was 31.
Is that common in victims of child sexual abuse that they turn to drugs?
It is a common path that we see a lot of survivors of child sexual abuse their life take. So often they will report turning to alcohol or to drugs as a way initially of trying to suppress or avoid the memories of the abuse. And then that spirals into, in some cases, really antisocial behaviour, criminal offences as they try and get the money to support their drug abuse habits. So often their lives do spiral into drug abuse and alcohol abuse, and often it has significant effects on relationships as well, because people that have suffered child sexual abuse, it's often very difficult for them to trust people. They often have difficulties with people in positions of authority because it's often someone that was in a position of power over them that breached that trust and abused them. So it often infiltrates every sort of aspect of someone's life. But that's certainly not an uncommon path for survivors of abuse to turn to drugs and alcohol and develop really dangerous addictions.
I notice I keep referring to them as victims and you keep referring to them as survivors. Is that terminology important?
It's an individual thing, I think. So some people will say that they do feel like a survivor, so they will prefer the term survivor because they feel like that was something that happened to them, but they're here. Other people that I've spoken to actually do refer to themselves as victims because it was something that happened to them. So I guess I use both because I think there are both. I think that what happened to them was perpetrated on them through no fault of their own, and I think that there are victims that are no longer with us because of the abuse that they've suffered. They didn't survive. But I also respect people that do refer to themselves as survivors as well. So I often say that there are victims and survivors of child sexual abuse.
Did R ever tell anyone?
Not that we're aware of.
Did he ever discuss it with Jay after it happened?
Not that we're aware of. Yeah.
So how did R's family become aware of what had happened to him and when?
Our client received a phone call from the police that were investigating the charges against Pell, and so he was told not of all of the detail, but of just generally that these were being investigated, and he answered some questions and obviously gave statements to the police. It was only really through the court process and the trials that he learnt about the detail in terms of the abuse on his son.
How long after his son had died was he informed?
Around 4 years. 4 years later.
And how has he described that phone call to you and what came after it for him and R's family?
I think the initial reaction that he has described to me was one of shock, that he was stunned. I think he's described that you could have blown him over like a feather. However, once he had time to digest it, a lot of things made sense to him, because one of the difficult parts that the family, so he as the father, went through was not knowing, because you sort of had a child that was really going off the rails but not knowing why, despite trying to get help and answers through psychologists. And so things became clearer once he was aware of that. And then I think there's been a whole range of emotions, from anger to, as I spoke about, guilt himself, and just a lot of sadness as to what his son went through.
Was your client called as a witness in Pell's trials?
So he did give a victim impact statement that did form part of the evidence at the sentencing submissions, which was held a couple of weeks ago. And he also has given evidence to the police and also at the committal hearing previously.
So when Pell was found guilty, what was that day like?
Well, at the time it was suppressed, so it couldn't be spoken about. So it was quite sort of a private feeling, and it gave some time for our client to be able to digest that. But he did feel that there was a sense of justice in that the perpetrator of the crimes was convicted of the crime against his son, and it didn't matter that he held the position that he did, that he was the highest ranking Australian Catholic figure, that he was still being held to account. And so he did feel that there was a sense of justice. He also felt saddened that his son never saw justice, but he also feels a responsibility to speak out about it because his son doesn't have a voice. So he does feel like he wants to have a voice around this issue to stop other kids from ever having to go through what his son did, and to stop any other family going through what they have.
The decision to suppress the name of R and his identity and his family, who controls that decision? Is it the family's decision or is it the court's decision, and who's that meant to benefit? Yeah,
it is the court's decision, and it is meant to benefit the families, the victims and the victims' families. So we know that the other victim, who has wished to remain very private and anonymous, and I think the courts do have to respect that. So there will be some people that do want to speak out about it under their name, but there will be many that don't want to, and the court's orders are to protect the identity of those individuals.
If your client decides that he wants to make his name public or the name of his son public, is he able to do that?
Not at this stage with the court order, and I think that it will depend on, because the two might be linked.
Because they were friends.
So whether by releasing the identity of one that it may impact on the identity of who the identity of the second person is. So that's why I think our client feels that he would be prepared to have his name out there, but he's very respectful of the other victim or survivor. He has a lot of admiration and gratitude, because it was him coming forward and sharing his story and be prepared to be cross-examined and was believed by the jury, that there has been this sense of justice for him.
We know because of his statement that the other victim has a young family, and I suppose we can only speculate as to the timing of whether that had anything to do with his decision to come forward. Do you know when he did come forward and go to the police?
I'm not entirely sure of the date, and I don't know the reasons why he came forward. Our client believes that it was soon after his son's funeral that may have prompted him to come forward, but I don't know, not having spoken to the other victim. But our client certainly believes that it was soon after the funeral of his son, which the other victim did attend.
And he was the only one at that funeral who knew what had happened.
That's right.
That would be a heavy burden to carry.
That's right, yeah.
What happens now? What does your client want?
So to date, our client has been really focused on the criminal process, the criminal justice system. That's coming to an end, although there is the appeal that he is very aware of that Cardinal Pell has lodged. But
do you have a view on how that appeal might go?
I don't, and it's something that our client is aware of but understands that he doesn't have any influence over. So his focus now is that George Pell has been convicted of child sexual assault offences, that he has been sentenced to a term of imprisonment. And the criminal process to date has been, rightly so, focused around holding Pell accountable for the specific crimes that he committed. Our client has instructed us to commence civil proceedings against the Catholic Church, and what we will be looking at in those proceedings is the culpability of the Catholic Church in this case, whether they could have or should have done more to stop the abuse from occurring.
The Catholic Church are a formidable opponent in court. They have fought long and hard, and at some times, under the direction of George Pell himself, a very vigorous, I guess, aggressive defence against these charges. Are you intimidated? Is your client intimidated?
He's not intimidated. I have so much admiration for the courage of all of the clients that we represent, survivors of abuse, their families, the father of Pell's victim who we represent now. They often do come forward and speak and bring claims, and it can be a really difficult process because it's re-traumatising to have to talk about it again and to see a doctor and talk about what they've been through. And they often do so because they do want change, so they want the institution held to account. They want an acknowledgement that the abuse happened. They do want assistance to allow them to continue to move forward with their lives. So it takes a tremendous amount of courage, but our client is certainly not intimidated by the Catholic Church and certainly wants them held accountable for, as Pell has been held accountable in a criminal sense, but he really wants to have a look at the system and to look at the failures that should be changed.
People will often use the fact that someone is suing for compensation as evidence that they're just a grifter looking for money, that they're in it for the money. What do you say to those people?
It's often not the main motivating factor for someone coming forward, particularly in this case.
It's not an easy way to get rich.
It's not. And nothing will ever compensate someone for what they've been through in terms of their life, because who knows how a life would have turned out often if they weren't subjected to the trauma as a child. So in my experience, it's not people coming forward looking for money and making these stories up. And the Royal Commission found that as well, that the rate of false reporting of child sexual abuse is very, very small.
The last few weeks has just seen such an avalanche of coverage of Michael Jackson, George Pell, all around this issue of child sex abuse. What's been the ripple effect of those victims and survivors that are in our community who have perhaps never spoken up before?
I think that there's a couple of ripple effects. One, I think that this has been a very traumatic time for a number of survivors of abuse in not being able to escape it. So I think that it is important for us to be aware, and for survivors of abuse to be aware that this is a very difficult time, and they may need help and extra help around this time where it is, as you've said, Mia, it's everywhere at the moment.
Yeah.
So it's very difficult to escape. Another ripple effect that we've seen is what we saw with the Royal Commission, is that when it's spoken about and when people see that people are held to account and that things are happening, then it does give them courage to come forward. So we've seen a number of people come forward to us speaking about it for the first time, seeking assistance. So I think that's a really positive thing that people are speaking and finding out about what their legal rights are and what they can do and what they want and what will help them moving forward. And it's only through people coming forward that change will occur that will then make it better for future children. But I also do think that this would be an incredibly difficult time for a number of survivors. And I just really do hope that they are able to reach out and get the help that they need, whether it be from a doctor or whether it be seeking advice around their legal options.
Lisa, this is a very heavy world that you work in. How did you get into it?
So when I first started at Shine, I was a very young article clerk, and I was in a department where we started running a group action against Brisbane Grammar School and St Paul's School in Brisbane, where there was a pedophile school counsellor who had abused, in my estimation, it would be in the thousands rather than hundreds of young boys. So we represented over 100 victims.
Was that your first case working on a child sex abuse case?
So that was 20 years ago. It was, nearly 20 years.
How old are you now?
I turned 40 in a couple of weeks. So I started, thank you. I started in 99, and so it would have been in about 2000, 2001 that we ran these cases. So
what did that involve from a practical point of view in terms of your work?
So that was my introduction to working with survivors of abuse. So I was 21 years of age, very junior solicitor, and we had people coming forward and reporting what has happened to them. Some of these men were in their 50s and 60s now and talking about experiences that they had suffered when they were 11, 12, 13 years of age. And that was an incredible experience where to be able to hear this story, and often I was the first person that these people had ever told their story to.
And you were 21?
I was 21, and we represented hundreds. So over 100 at that time. We've represented a number since that time. But there was a sort of an initial group action that we took forward.
So you had to hear these incredibly traumatic stories.
Yes.
All day, every day, for months.
Every day
and
for
months.
Yes.
And even though it was the 75th story you'd heard, it was probably the first time that man had ever told it.
Definitely. That was exactly what it was like. Wow. And I remember people asking at that time, how do you do this? So that's every day. How do you do this? And I said, look, I am very fortunate. I feel very lucky that at that time it was very far removed from my life. So it was something that I had not experienced. However, I was able to feel a lot of empathy, and I also didn't have children of my own, so I was able to really do that work without it impacting personally. And so we did that for a number of years, and then I worked in different areas within the same company, Shine, and it's been sort of recently, since the Royal Commission, that I got back into assisting survivors of abuse quite heavily. And it was a little bit of a different experience this time because by now I've had my own children, and it is a little bit different in terms of hearing the stories because you can't actually help. Well, I can't help but think, wow, you were 5 years old, so that's the age of my youngest daughter now, and it hits a bit harder sometimes. So sometimes there are cases that do, I think that all of the cases affect you in some way because you can't help but feel for that kid that they were when these things happened to them, and look at how their life could have been different had that not occurred.
With all the survivors you've spoken to over the course of the last 20 years, and I imagine they would be in there probably thousands, have you noticed patterns in terms of how people are affected and how they deal with it?
It's very individual, but there are patterns, and some of those patterns are the drug and the alcohol abuse. Some of the patterns are relationship difficulties. In some cases, people are very successful for a number of years, but it will be a certain triggering event that everything falls apart for them, and they're not able to sort of get back to that. There's some survivors that their lives sort of go from high achieving for a period of time, but then a low where everything sort of breaks down, and then they build up again, and followed by breakdowns. So I think that there are a number of, it's individual of course because everyone is different, but there certainly are some trends that you do see in terms of how people try and deal with childhood trauma.
Do you see patterns in the abusers? Are there things that should be red flags to us more in society?
Where there is a dangerous environment is where there is a lot of authority and trust placed in people that can go unchecked. So environments in a number of places where there's high levels of discipline coupled with people in authority having close access to children, that creates an environment where it's much more difficult for the child to speak up about it. So boarding schools and private schools in the past where there's high levels of discipline coupled with the ability for offenders to have close contact with children. There's often a period of grooming behaviour, of building trust that offenders do go into. What you do find is that some use the same sorts of threats to silence their victims as well. So no one will believe you. That'll be, who would they believe over you or me? You're just going to get into trouble. You'll get suspended. You won't be able to be part of the Scouts group anymore. Your parents will be really mad at you. I can actually hurt your parents. So there's a lot of sometimes a lot of threats involved once the abuse has started. So there are some things that make, I guess, different institutions or places more vulnerable, or where we do have to take extra precautions to protect children.
With historical child sex abuse allegations, I imagine one of the hardest things is evidence, because these crimes are almost always committed when only those two people are in the room, the perpetrator and the victim, and there's rarely physical evidence, and sometimes it might be decades later that the victim or the survivor is able to come out and talk about it. As a lawyer, how do you get around that when it comes down to he said, two people in a room, and one of them was a child, therefore can, I imagine, quite easily be painted as an unreliable witness?
So in terms of the criminal justice system, it is hard for the prosecution to prove, because they need to prove beyond reasonable doubt. And so it will often come down to the word of one person who was a child at the time against the word of the other. But the jury hears evidence. They hear evidence from the person, from the victim. They have to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, which does make it very difficult to secure a guilty verdict. However, it's not impossible, and I think that that's what this trial shows, is that these offences were committed a number of years ago. There wasn't a lot of corroborative or witness or supportive evidence. However, the jury, when they hear all of the evidence that is available, which includes the testimony of the victim and the fact that he was cross-examined by a very strong legal team
for hours,
and that they accepted his evidence, shows that it is possible to get convictions on these historical criminal matters. With civil cases, which is where my practice is, the standard of proof is lower than in a criminal case. So we need to prove on the balance of probabilities that the abuse occurred, which again can be difficult where you've got no witnesses, but that's the part of child sexual abuse, and that's why it can happen, is because it is usually away from anyone else, and it usually is only the perpetrator and the victim in the room. So it is difficult. However, again, the evidence that the victim or survivor themselves gives is still evidence, and we try and get as much corroborative evidence around in terms of putting the perpetrator in the sort of place where it happened at that right time, putting the client there, whatever evidence there is around that, if there have been previous reports of abuse, what's happened in their life since. So we try and put together the whole picture to prove on the balance of probabilities that the abuse happened.
And in the Pell case, it's astonishing and preposterous that people are saying, oh, I don't think it happened, because no one apart from the jury and the judge heard the victim's evidence because it was sealed and suppressed, right?
Yeah.
And no one will hear that evidence.
Yeah.
So the only evidence we've heard is of the defence rebutting it. Correct me if I'm wrong. But no one can judge except that jury and the judge, and that jury found him unanimously guilty on all charges.
That's right. I think that some of the commentary around after the conviction of Pell was, I think in my opinion, could be quite dangerous, because it's disrespectful to the jury's decision, and it's comments from people that haven't heard all of the evidence. So it was the jury that heard all of the evidence over 5 weeks, and they deliberated, and these are 12 independent men and women chosen randomly, and they came up with a unanimous guilty verdict. So to question that, I think, is one, disrespectful and dangerous in terms of the legal system, but also dangerous in terms of survivors of abuse generally, because you've got someone that's spoken to police, and the police have made a decision to charge, and then spoken to the prosecution and they've made a decision to prosecute, and then it's gone to a 5-week hearing, and there's been cross-examination, and a jury, as the legal system says they have to do, have come up with a decision, and it's been a unanimous guilty verdict, and yet still people are saying, we don't believe you, you're lying. And I just think that that's incredibly dangerous and can be really damaging to the survivor.
What does your client hope for George Pell now?
I think that our client would like to see George Pell not be released. So I do think, and speaking with him, I do think that his feelings are that he would rather him die in prison compared to the life that his son lived from sort of 13 to 31 was horrendous, and then he's lost his son. He sees sort of Pell has lived a long life with a lot of luxuries and a lot of privileges and a lot of life that his son never had. So, in speaking with him, I think that he would be disappointed if Pell was released back into the community.
Was he a religious man, your client?
He was, and did attend church. He no longer attends church. He has his own beliefs, his own faith that he has described, but he doesn't attend church as he used to.
And how do you get through all of this? How do you wade through this cesspool of information and grief and trauma as your job every working day?
Yeah, I think...
I didn't make it sound that good, did I?
Yeah. Look, it is...
I didn't really leave you much room to go, it's not that bad.
It's not that bad. I think, well, in my mind, I find it a very rewarding job, because...
You must
often,
to still be in it.
Yeah, often it's a real privilege to be trusted by these people, to be their voice when they've never had a voice previously, to be able to fight against the injustice, to hold institutions to account, to press for change that will protect children in the future. So I find it an incredibly rewarding job, and I really do find it a privilege to represent these very courageous survivors of abuse that come forward. And so in that, I love my job. But there are really tough days, and it makes you question sometimes how these people could do this to children when your automatic feeling to any child and is to protect a child and to keep them away from harm. So it's very hard to understand what goes through someone's mind to harm a child. And so I've given up trying to do that because it's inconceivable to me. It is. So I really focus on the positive part of it and the courage of the survivors and the change that will happen and continue to happen because of the courage that survivors have in coming forward. And I go home and I'm able to, I feel I give my all when I'm at work, but I'm also quite good at being able to turn it off when I do go home because I think it would be very hard if I wasn't able to do that to then enjoy my life with my family, which does include young children as well.
We don't want you to burn out, Lisa. Thank you for being a voice for R and his family and for so many survivors and victims of child sex abuse. You're doing incredible work.
Thank you so much. But the incredible work, I think, is from the survivors, but it's, as I said, it's just a privilege and a pleasure to be able to assist them. So thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to this episode of No Filter. You know, Lisa has a very full life outside what she does and the work she does with the victims and survivors of child sexual abuse. She's also a marriage celebrant, I learned when we were chatting afterwards. And it's such a juxtaposition, isn't it? But in actual fact, I think that's a brilliant way to balance all the grief and the trauma that she's exposed to every day by being around people and helping being part of the happiest days of people's lives. She gets to see people on their best days as well as their hardest days. It's a really tough time for anyone who has been affected or knows anyone who has been affected by child sexual abuse. Please make sure you take care of yourself and each other. For 24-hour support, please call 1-800-RESPECT, or you can also call Lifeline on 13 11 14. No Filter is produced by Eliza Ratliff. I'm Mia Friedman, and I'll see you on mamamia.com.au.